The bell above the door gave a cheerful chime when she stepped in. It was late afternoon, the kind of sleepy hour where the sun casts long golden arms through the tall windows, and the whole place smells like a blend of brewed espresso, old wood, and crisp paper. Pinbridge Books, nestled on a gentrified corner in a city that prided itself on being literary chic, had always drawn a particular crowd. 30-something readers with expensive glasses, college students in oversized sweaters, and staff who wore book knowledge like a badge. The woman who entered didn't fit the aesthetic. Her cardigan was thrifted and pilled at the cuffs. Her gray hair was pulled into a tidy bun with a simple elastic band, not a silk scrunchie. She walked with a slight limp in her left leg, the kind that came not from age, but memory. In her hand was a canvas tote that had seen more rain than sun. She didn't browse right away. She paused, took it in, let the air of the place settle around her like dust. From behind the counter, 2 clerks noticed her. One of them, a young man with tortoiseshell glasses and a voice that often climbed when he thought he was being clever, whispered to the other, "Looks like someone's wandered in from the wrong decade." The other, a young woman with a half-shaved head and a nose ring, glanced over, smirked, and said, "Maybe she's looking for the large-print cozy mysteries." They laughed. Not loud, but loud enough. The woman didn't react. If she heard them, she gave no sign. She moved with purpose, her fingers trailing along the spines like she was reading the room through the books themselves. Her eyes lingered on the staff recommendations shelf, where post-it notes boasted quotes like mind-blowing prose, a new voice in literary fiction, and read it in one sitting. You'll thank me later. At the center of the display sat a thick paperback, stark white cover, minimalist type, no author photo, just the title, The Fifth Silence. It was one of those books that exploded seemingly overnight. No marketing blitz, no celebrity endorsements, just word of mouth and a trail of stunned readers who found themselves pausing mid-chapter with their breath held. The bookstore had sold nearly 400 copies in the last month alone. It had gone viral in a quiet way, the way the best books do. The woman picked up a copy, held it like something fragile. Her thumb brushed the bottom corner, where the publisher's imprint was printed in small, neat letters. She turned it over. No author biography, no acknowledgments, no praise from literary giants. Just a single sentence. Sometimes the loudest truth is the one no one hears. A clerk, not one of the ones who laughed, approached her with polite retail energy. That one's been really popular, he offered. No one knows who wrote it. Anonymous author. Kind of a publishing experiment. She nodded slowly. Eyes still on the book. Would you like a copy? He asked. No, she said softly. I already know how it ends. She placed it back on the table gently, almost reverently, and moved toward the nonfiction aisle. Behind her, the 2 clerks at the register watched. See, the woman with the nose ring whispered. Total weirdo vibe. I bet she's the kind that writes letters to editors in all caps, the young man added. Their laughter was sharper this time. Crueler, not because of volume, but because of certainty. They were so sure she didn't belong. So sure her presence was accidental. So sure they were the ones who knew something she didn't. She wandered the store for another 10 minutes. Picked up nothing else. She made her way to the back, where a chalkboard easel stood near the cafe counter. On it was scrawled in messy, artsy script. Author event, this Friday, 7 p.m. The Fifth Silence. In conversation with the publisher. Discussion, Q&A, and a special announcement. A few names were listed underneath. None of them were the author. She stared at the board a moment longer than she needed to. Then, as if she were checking something off a list, she walked back toward the front of the store. As she passed the register, the male clerk forced a customer service smile and chirped, "Hope you found what you were looking for." She paused just long enough to reply, "I always do." And then she was gone. The bell chimed again behind her, soft and final. The clerks returned to their chatter, unaware that something had shifted in the air. They didn't know the truth hanging silently in that store. That every time they stocked that table, ran another report showing how the Fifth Silence was outselling expectations, bragged about how their shop had helped launch a movement. They were selling her words. She had written that book. All of it. Every sentence. And she hadn't put her name on the cover, not out of fear, but out of choice. Until now. Now, things were different. And in 4 days, she'd be back in that bookstore. Not with a shopping bag. Not with a question, but with a chair at the front of the room, and a microphone in her hand. 3 days before the event, She sat at her kitchen table, the same table where every chapter of The Fifth Silence had been written. The room was small, quiet, with lace curtains that filtered the morning light onto a faded wooden surface. A cup of tea sat cooling beside her. A spiral notebook lay open, its pages worn at the edges. She wasn't writing today. She was reading the words she'd once let go of. She needed to remember how they'd first come to her, the shape of them, the weight. The book had been born not out of ambition, but necessity. A release. A reckoning. It wasn't about a great plot or genre hooks. It was about memory and grief, and the way silence can fill a room louder than any scream. It was the story of a woman who had lost everything, not all at once, but piece by piece. Her voice, her trust, her name, until she learned to write her way back. And every part of it was her. But no one knew that. Not yet. When she first submitted the manuscript, it had no name on it. Just a plain white cover letter that read, "Use it if you think it matters. Don't ask me who I am." She hadn't expected a reply. But 3 weeks later, one came, short, curious, but respectful. The publisher had been intrigued, moved. They wanted more. Not details, just permission. They offered to publish it under anonymous, a rarity in a world obsessed with platforms and author personas. But they said it added mystery, marketing potential. She agreed, but only with one condition. She would retain all rights, all royalties, and the option to reveal herself if the moment ever felt right. She never expected that moment would arrive in a bookstore where she'd once been laughed at. But life has its own symmetry. Back then, she hadn't wanted the attention. She didn't want to go on tour, do readings, stand on stages, and pretend to be fine. Because she wasn't. She had lost her husband the year before, not to an illness, but to a slow erasure. He had fallen out of love with the life they'd built together, moved across the country, and left her with silence where laughter used to be. She didn't blame him. Not really. But the loss was still real. And it echoed. So she wrote. Every night. Every morning. In between working at the library and running errands. She didn't try to make it pretty. She just made it honest. And when it was done, she left her name off because she wanted the story to breathe without being tied to a face that no longer felt like hers. But now the world had read it, and loved it, and wanted more. And more importantly, she had changed. The quiet no longer swallowed her. It steadied her. 2 days before the event, she received a call from the publisher. An assistant named Jamie spoke in the clipped, upbeat tone of someone who balanced a dozen tasks at once. "We're really excited for this Friday," Jamie said. "Everyone's buzzing about it. We've kept the announcement vague like you asked. Special guest appearance. It's driving people crazy. Some think it's a celebrity ghostwriter. One guy on Reddit swears it's Margaret Atwood using a pen name." She smiled softly at that. "Let's not disappoint him too badly." Jamie laughed. "We've got press coming. Local media. A couple literary bloggers. We won't out you in advance. We'll let the reveal happen live. If that's still your plan?" "Yes," she said. "It's time." There was a pause on the other end. Then Jamie added, "I read your book again last night. For the 3rd time. I just wanted to say thank you for writing something that doesn't try to fix pain, but lets it sit long enough to become something else." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's all I hoped it would do." The day before the event, she returned to the bookstore. Unannounced. No makeup. Same cardigan. She walked in and was greeted by a different employee this time. A quiet girl with glasses and a clipboard. The others, the ones who had laughed, were not there. She moved to the shelf where her book still stood. Now there were 6 copies left. A handwritten sign read, "Limited stock before Friday's event. Grab your copy now." She picked one up, turned it over. Still anonymous. Still that single sentence on the back. Sometimes the loudest truth is the one no one hears. She would keep that line. But the next edition would carry her name. Not because she needed recognition, because she had earned it. And because there were women walking into bookstores every day who looked like her and deserved to know they weren't invisible. She brought the book to the counter. The girl behind the register smiled politely. "Great pick. Everyone's talking about this one." "Is that so?" she asked, already amused. "Oh yeah. It's been our bestseller for 6 weeks straight. We're hosting a reading for it tomorrow. The author's going to make a surprise appearance." The woman nodded. "Do you know who it is?" "No clue," the clerk said. "Not even the manager knows. They say it's someone local. Someone unexpected." She smiled faintly and handed over a $20 bill. "I think they're right." She left the store with one of the last and signed copies of her own book in her tote bag, heart calm, steps steady. That night, she sat at her table again, took out a pen, opened the book to the first page, and wrote. To the woman who thought no one would care what she had to say, "This is for you. You were wrong." And that's the best kind of surprise. E.M. Bell. It was the first time she signed her name to it. A name no one had seen in print before. A name she'd once thought didn't matter anymore. But tomorrow, in the place where they'd laughed at her, that name would echo. Not loudly, not boastfully, but clearly. And finally, by the time the sun began to sink behind the old brick skyline of downtown, the front window of Pinbridge Books was already fogged with anticipation. Folding chairs had been arranged in crooked rows, pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath vintage Edison bulbs that glowed like amber pearls. A temporary podium had been placed in front of the store's signature rolling bookshelf ladder, and a small table held a carefully arranged stack of The Fifth Silence, its matte white covers forming a gleaming wall of quiet expectation. Outside, a line was forming, the kind that bookstore owners dream about, and that neighbors side-eye with curiosity. Young people in turtlenecks and scarves, older couples who had read about the book in the local paper, book club attendees clutching marked-up copies covered in sticky notes and scribbles. Some came because they'd read the book and had been moved by it. Others came because they wanted to see the mystery solved. Anonymous authors don't just show up on a Friday night at independent bookstores. But someone was about to. Inside, staff rushed through final checks. The store manager, a round, bespectacled man named Elliot, paced near the counter, chewing his lower lip, phone in hand, eyes darting toward the door every 10 seconds. He didn't know who the author was. Not really. The publisher had arranged the event with cloaked vagueness. They'd sent a press kit with a single-paragraph bio, an emerging literary voice, publishing anonymously by choice, now ready to step forward. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir the air with expectation. In the back, the two clerks who had laughed, Ryan and Skye, were busy restocking cups and napkins at the makeshift refreshment table. Neither had spoken about the incident earlier in the week. Whether they remembered the woman from Monday didn't matter, because they certainly didn't recognize her yet. "You think it's a celebrity?" Ryan asked, arranging tiny squares of cheese onto a tray. "I read online someone thinks it's a Pulitzer winner testing a new voice," Skye said, scrolling through her phone. "Or it's a man writing under a woman's perspective." "Why would anyone go anonymous on a book that good?" he asked. She shrugged. Maybe they were scared it wouldn't be taken seriously. Ryan snorted. "They should have seen the crowds that came through asking for it. I mean, it's not my thing, but the writing's solid. Especially the ending." A soft, weary voice behind them added. "The ending almost didn't happen." They both turned. She stood there, coat draped over one arm, a simple black blouse buttoned at the collar, and that same quiet expression they'd overlooked. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't frowning. She just existed, with a presence that now felt unsettling. Ryan tilted his head. "Sorry, do we know you?" Skye narrowed her eyes. "You were here earlier this week." "Yes," the woman said. "And you were right. I don't belong here. Not the way you expected." Elliot rushed forward. "Sorry, ma'am. We're actually closed to the public until the..." The publisher's rep stepped in from behind her, clipboard in hand. "She's with me." Skye blinked. "Wait, you're..." The woman nodded. "I'm the reason you had to rearrange your schedule tonight." And then she stepped past them, toward the podium, the buzz of the crowd filtering into the room like static before a song. Skye stood frozen, mouth parted, her earlier words echoing in her head like a mocking ghost. She couldn't even remember what she'd said, only how casually cruel she'd been. The author. It was her. The woman they had laughed at, judged, dismissed. The woman now sitting behind a table where people lined up for her signature. Elliot whispered to Ryan, "Make sure we have water on the table. Good pens. And, God, find her a chair." Within minutes, the bookstore filled with voices, not loud, but reverent. Readers hugged their copies to their chests. A woman with silver hair and a face mapped with worry lines whispered to her friend, "That book saved me from drowning last winter. I wrote a letter to the author. Never mailed it." The woman who wrote it sat at the front, quietly flipping through a copy, her own words now foreign and familiar all at once. She saw the underlining, the coffee stains, the crumpled covers. These books had been lived with. She hadn't expected that. When the event officially began, Elliot stepped to the mic and offered a few strained, trembling words about welcoming a voice that's moved this community. Then the publisher's rep introduced her with a single sentence. "It's time we meet the voice behind the fifth silence. Please welcome E.M. Bell." She rose. The crowd clapped, some awkwardly, others earnestly. No one knew exactly what to expect from this woman. No TED Talks, no Instagram page, no public persona. She walked to the podium and looked out at the audience, the bookshelves, the wide, anticipating eyes. And then she said, "I was here 3 days ago. I stood at that table and watched 2 young clerks laugh at me. Not because I did anything, just because I didn't look like someone they thought had value." The silence tightened. "I don't tell you that for sympathy," she said. "I tell you that because that moment is why I wrote The Fifth Silence." A murmur stirred. I wanted to know what it felt like to speak when no one is listening, to exist when no one sees you, to scream inwardly while smiling outwardly, and to survive it, not with vengeance, but with clarity. She paused, and then, almost gently, "I didn't put my name on this book because I didn't think it needed one. I thought the story mattered more than the storyteller. But then I realized, the storyteller matters when no one believes she exists." She turned a page. "And so I came back, not to prove a point, but to claim my place." The applause was slow to begin, not because it wasn't deserved, but because the crowd was still catching up. What they had expected was performance. What they had received was truth. And truth, spoken softly, often lands louder than anything else. She read 3 passages, each one chosen for the people who never say much, the ones who live on the edge of notice, who carry weight in silence. People we pass in stores, on sidewalks, behind counters, never wondering what stories they hold. When she finished, she took questions. Someone asked why she stayed anonymous. "I didn't want to be looked at," she said. "I wanted to be heard." Another asked why she revealed herself now. She smiled. "Because it's time to show what a writer looks like. Not on a cover. In a room like this." When the signing line began, the first person to step forward was the woman who hadn't mailed the letter. She held it in her hand now, shaking, and asked if she could read it. She did, then handed it to the woman who wrote the book that had helped her hold on. Behind her, Skye waited, silent, holding a copy she'd just bought. No longer mocking, now listening and learning. Margaret, E.M. Bell, signed her name and said softly, "It's good to meet you again." And this time, Skye didn't say a word. The line wrapped past the poetry aisle and curled toward the cookbook section, but no one complained. They stood quietly, shifting the weight of their books from hand to hand, exchanging polite nods, murmuring softly about what they might say when it was their turn. A few carried post-its with questions. Some had dog-eared pages they wanted to ask about. Others simply clutched their copies of The Fifth Silence like something sacred, not quite sure how to explain what it meant to hold it now, knowing the author wasn't a mystery anymore, but a woman standing right in front of them. She signed every book, every single one, with a pen she'd brought herself. Not fancy, blue ink, ballpoint, steady hand. She didn't use pre-written inscriptions or generic phrases. She asked people their names. She listened. She smiled, not the wide, practiced kind used for book jackets or photo ops, but the kind you give when someone tells you they saw themselves in your words. That kind of smile doesn't need to stretch to be real. A teenager in a faded hoodie with chipped nail polish whispered that she'd read the book 3 times and didn't think she'd ever write again, until chapter 12. The woman looked her in the eyes and said, then read it a 4th time. But this time, with a pen in your hand. A man in his 50s confessed that he hadn't finished the book yet, that he was reading it slowly, afraid to reach the end because it felt like losing a friend. She said, "Books don't end. They echo. It'll wait for you." A librarian came forward with 6 copies in her arms. She explained that they were for a reading group at a senior center, where most of the members couldn't leave their homes anymore, but passed the same copy around week by week, writing thoughts in the margins. The woman signed each one individually. For Ruth, thank you for noticing page 47. For Harold, your memory of the sea is safe here. For Eileen, you are seen. Somewhere around the 50th book, someone asked if she was tired. She laughed gently. I was tired before I wrote the book. Now I'm just full. At the back of the line, a woman in her 60s stood with folded arms and tear-filled eyes. She held no book. When she reached the table, she simply said, I don't want your autograph. I just want to say, thank you for not writing it louder. The author's eyes softened. I don't think I ever learned how to write loud, she replied. That's why I trusted you. And that, more than anything, marked the shift in the room. This wasn't just a signing anymore. It was a gathering. A gentle uprising of the overlooked, the softened, the people who'd been talked over in boardrooms, talked down to in bookstores, ignored in job interviews, mistaken for secretaries, receptionists, grandmothers, nobodies. Now they were here, each one staring into the face of a woman who'd been dismissed, who'd worn invisibility like armor, who had slipped through their judgment and returned, not to punish, but to illuminate. The press arrived late. 2 photographers with intrusive lenses and a local arts reporter who hadn't read the book but had printed out quotes from Goodreads. He came looking for a soundbite. What he got was a moment that refused to be reduced to headline. He asked, "Why now? Why reveal yourself after all this time?" She didn't look at the camera. She looked at the girl still lingering near the poetry shelf, watching her with awe. Because some people needed to see that writers look like this. And she gestured to herself. Cardigan, flats, gray bun, tired eyes, gentle hands. Not curated, just real. Later, the store's manager, Elliot, approached her privately. He had tears in his eyes, the kind men of a certain generation try hard to hide. He fumbled through an apology about how they hadn't known, how they hadn't meant harm. She stopped him gently. I wasn't hurt by what was said, she told him. I've heard worse. Still, he said, it wasn't right. No, she agreed. But it was familiar. And sometimes familiarity is what wakes us up. He asked if she'd consider doing more events, a tour, maybe. She smiled. No tours. Just truths. Maybe I'll come back. But not for lights and applause. For people. The event went on for nearly 3 hours. And at the end, when the last book had been signed and the chairs stacked and the wine glasses cleared, she stood alone by the front table and looked at the stack of remaining books. Only 3 copies left. She picked one up and opened to the back flap, running her thumb across the words. There was still no author photo, but the next print run would include one. She had chosen it that morning. Not a studio portrait, not a pose shot. Just a candid photo of her seated on her back porch, reading her own book under a wool blanket, her glasses sliding slightly down her nose. A photo taken by a neighbor, not a publicist. It looked like a woman you'd pass on the sidewalk. And maybe that's why it mattered. As she prepared to leave, she noticed something different near the checkout counter. A handwritten chalkboard had been placed beside the register. It read, "This store once sold the words of a woman it didn't recognize. Now we sell them with reverence. Ask us about Yim Bell, or better yet, tell us what she meant to you." She didn't write it. She didn't need to. The next morning, photos from the event were posted online. Not by her, by readers. People who'd met her, seen her, heard her speak. One caption read, "She didn't need a spotlight. She needed a seat at the table. So she built her own." Another post simply said, "The author was nothing like I imagined. She was better." And slowly, gently, the narrative began to change. Yim Bell became more than a name. She became proof. Proof that a woman can be passed over, laughed at, underestimated, and still rise. Not by shouting, by showing up. Again, and again, and again, until the story writes itself back into the room. And stays there. By Monday morning, Pembridge Books no longer looked quite the same. Not in any dramatic way, not in the layout of the tables or the smell of brewed espresso drifting through the air. No, the difference was quieter than that. Subtler, like something had been gently reset, like someone had finally turned the volume down on the performative hum and tuned into something truer. At the front of the store, where the rotating staff picks shelf once displayed titles with neon index cards covered in witty blurbs, a new addition had been made. A brass plaque had been drilled into the dark wood trim beneath the window. No fanfare, no press release. Just a line of text that read, "In honor of the author who reminded us that being unseen is not the same as being insignificant, Yim Bell." Beneath it, a shelf had been stocked with copies of The Fifth Silence. But not just that. They included the new edition, the one with her name on the cover, printed in soft serif below the title. And for the first time, a photo on the back flap. She was looking off to the side, mid-smile, a strand of silver hair pulled loose by the wind. It wasn't glossy. It wasn't staged. It was her. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. But it started with the staff. Ryan, The young man who had once mocked her with a careless smirk began showing up to work 5 minutes early. Not because he feared reprimand. There had been none. She never demanded apology. But something about the way she looked at him when she said, "It's good to meet you again," had pierced something deeper than shame. He started shelving books more carefully, reading staff emails more closely. One morning, he brought in a box of muffins he'd baked himself and left a note that simply read, "We don't know who we're serving until we ask." Sky, for her part, began curating a new recommendation shelf. Not for trending TikTok pics or buzzy debut novels, but a shelf labeled, "For the quiet voices, the ones who changed us when we weren't paying attention." The Fifth Silence sat in the middle, flanked by classics and overlooked gems written by authors with stories as humble as their prose was powerful. Customers began to ask more questions. Not just what's selling, but what's resonating, and the conversations changed. Deeper, slower, less about hype, more about heart. The bookstore hosted a new kind of reading group, one inspired by Bell's approach. It wasn't genre-specific or centered on trending titles. It was called the Listening Circle, and it met twice a month. Readers brought books that had made them feel seen, not necessarily understood, not necessarily healed, but seen. At the first meeting, someone brought The Fifth Silence. "I read it in a coffee shop," the man said, his voice tight with emotion. "And I started crying. Right there. In public. Because for the first time, someone put into words what it felt like to be strong without being hard." Another woman brought a copy so annotated it looked like a notebook. "I was a nurse for 27 years, she said. Then I retired, and the world stopped looking at me like I mattered. But this book reminded me that worth doesn't expire." Word spread. The store's traffic picked up. But more importantly, its meaning deepened. Bell, whose true name was known now only to those who truly listened, did not attend every event. She didn't return for every launch. But sometimes, she'd wander in, just as before. Same cardigan. Same soft steps. And people would notice. Not because she made a scene. Because the silence around her had changed. Now, when she walked in, someone would nod. Someone would whisper, "That's her." But not with the hushed or reserved for celebrity. With recognition. Like acknowledging the neighbor who once handed you a cup of sugar but didn't tell you she'd written the thing that held your spirit together last winter. One afternoon, she came in to browse. Elliot, the store manager, greeted her with the kind of warmth usually reserved for old friends. "I've been meaning to ask," he said as she examined a new memoir on the front table. "Would you ever consider teaching a writing workshop?" She smiled gently. "What would I even teach?" He laughed. "Humility, for starters." She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But 3 weeks later, a flyer appeared on the back bulletin board. Writing between the words, "A 4-week workshop with Bell. For those who don't think they're writers, but have something to say anyway." 12 people signed up in the first hour. Teachers, parents, a former line cook, a teenager who had been quietly journaling between classes but never let anyone read her work. On the first day, the author sat on a folding chair in the middle of the circle. No podium, no notes. "I'm not here to teach you how to be loud," she said. "I'm here to remind you that the quietest voices often carry the deepest echoes." They wrote, and they listened, and in every line scratched into notebook pages, a little more of the world tilted gently back toward grace. And the bookstore, once known mostly for bestsellers and display aesthetics, became something more. It became a place where people no longer judged by appearance, where staff began greeting older women with not just politeness, but interest, where new releases were shelved next to books that almost didn't get published, where conversations about margins and sales reports were matched by conversations about meaning. Years later, when someone asked Elliot during an anniversary interview how the store had stayed relevant, he didn't credit marketing or events. He said, "We learned to recognize worth when it doesn't announce itself." And when asked if he could remember when that shift began, he smiled softly. Yes, the day a simple woman walked in and picked up the book she wrote. The one we didn't know came from her hands. He paused, and then she walked back in to claim it. The interviewer asked if he still kept in touch with her. "She comes by," he said. "Not often, not loudly, but when she does, we all feel it. Like the store exhales." At the back of the building, by the door that leads to the small courtyard garden the staff built with customer donations, a bench now sits beneath a canopy of climbing roses. Carved into its back are the words, "To the woman who showed us silence isn't absence, it's authorship." And sometimes, on early mornings when the store hasn't opened yet and the sky is still soft with dawn, that bench isn't empty. She sits there. No book tour, no entourage, just her. A woman who was once laughed out of a room that didn't know her name. And now? Now they never forget it.